Okay, I think we're about ready to begin. I'm Sue Walton. I'm the administrator of the Council of Georgist Organizations. It's my pleasure to introduce Adam Kerman, who's a member of the Chicago Henry George School. The Henry George School of Chicago is a co-sponsor of tonight's event. And with that, I'll take it away. Adam?
Hi, I'm Adam Kerman. Thank you for coming this evening. I would like to introduce our speaker, David Wilson. A lifelong observer of urban and suburban history, David holds a bachelor's degree in transportation from Kent State University and a master's in urban planning and policy degree from the University of Illinois at Chicago. He's taken additional urban history coursework with Professor Ann Durkin Keating at North Central College, which is in Naperville, Illinois, a western suburb of Chicago. David is the author of a book and numerous articles on Chicago's transportation history. His forthcoming book, Towns Along the Q, will be a history of the development of Chicago's suburbs along the commuter rail line. And when David was telling me about the work he was doing for the book and some of the things he had gotten to that might not end up in the final manuscript, I said to him, David, you have a Georgist program. So here he is. And would everybody please welcome David Wilson?
So I am honored to have been asked to do this program. As Adam described, I've been working on this book, Towns Along the Q, for a while, and I'm going to be working on it for a while still. I'll describe a little bit about it when we get into the program here. What we're going to do here is we're going to, well, first I'm going to get the program going. We are going to discuss in summary form suburban living for most of us. That's a little tongue-in-cheek reference. Evolution of residential development in Chicago's western suburbs. Because this is being done in a very limited amount of time, we're going to be kind of doing skipping of stones across the water, kind of touching on a variety of topics. I might call this the subtitle, Log Cabins to McMansions in 180 Years. Well, these are the topics that we're going to discuss very quickly. Each of them in itself could be a whole program or even a college course, but we're going to keep it to a summary description of things and how they are somewhat interrelated. So where are we? We are in the western suburbs of Chicago. Over to the right, you see Lake Michigan, and you see a whole bunch of suburbs stretched out inside this red oval. These are the communities that are the subject of Towns Along the Q, and I'll explain as we go along why they're towns along the Q. So in the beginning consisting of someplace between 10,000 years ago and 1827, the territory was purely Native American. Oh, an occasional fur trapper here and there, or fur trader here and there. But otherwise, in the last several decades preceding the arrival of European American settlers, it was Potawatomi who had a series of villages. When it was Potawatomi villages, there was no need to talk about land or taxation or anything like that, because there wasn't any such thing as private land ownership, measurement, or sale. But with the coming of European Americans, that would change. So what happened? In 1827, there was a transition time from fur trading to opening up of the frontier for European Americans, basically white people. We had our first racial change and racial segregation in the sense that the Indian Exclusion Act, Federal Act of 1830, said Native Americans couldn't live on the land that they had occupied for the previous 10,000 or so years. It was furthermore driven home by the Black Hawk War in 1832 and the subsequent 1835 settlement, where the agreement was all the Potawatomi would leave. So between 1827 and 1833, a series of settlers opened up residences, taverns, and general stores, getting themselves positioned for when more people were going to be coming to settle there. So after the American Revolution, there was the issue of, well, we have all this land, but we can only sell it if we know how to measure it. So how do we measure it? This was a heavily Thomas Jefferson influenced plan by which the entire landscape would be divided into squares, 1 mile squares that were aggregated into 6 by 6 or 36-mile squares. Those were called townships. Not townships as we know them today. Now townships are governmental bodies. In that time, townships were simply, they were survey townships, namely a name to give to a section of land so that land could be sold and identified without anybody ever having actually seen it. So the important thing here is that these sections were then divided into half sections and quarter sections and quarter sections. In the early days of land sale, the federal government kept reducing the amount that was the minimum that you needed to buy till it got down to the quarter section, 40 acres. 40 acres was an important number because that was deemed to be what an individual family would need as land to be self-sufficient as a farm. 40 acres also was important in the wake of the Civil War, not in this territory, but down in the South, where one of the terms of Reconstruction was that freed slaves, as part of the land reform that ultimately didn't happen, was that each freed slave would get 40 acres and a mule. So it was this basic measurement that moved forward as the way that land would be, that was just federal land would then become land in the hands of individual private citizens. I'm going to describe here the Illinois and Michigan Canal as kind of tangentially, in the sense that while all this was happening, it was deemed appropriate, while people were settling, it was deemed appropriate to build a canal, dig a canal from Lake Michigan down to the navigable Illinois River waterway. And two things happened with that. One was a treaty was executed with the Native Americans for a strip of land that would be where European Americans, white people, would be allowed to just use this land. It was basically ceded by the natives. And the second thing was, once the Canal Commission was established, they said, well, how are we going to pay for this? So there was a land grant by the federal government to the Canal Commission, where alternating sections, 1 mile square, were given the Canal Commission to sell, and those then became known in transactions as canal lands. This is what they looked like. You'll see the the old Indian boundary. There are still all kinds of things in Chicago where you'll find, oh, the Indian boundary golf course or odd little streets here and there that delineate the edge of that land. So this is a list of patents issued for the Illinois and Michigan Canal lands. This is the cover for this, and I just picked a page with identifiable names. The most important name here is William B. Ogden, an early Chicago resident, first mayor of Chicago, and one of Chicago's leading land speculators. Another name that was important here locally was Theodorus Doty. We'll see reference to him in a moment. So the problem then administratively was that when people came out to settle on these lands, the land office hadn't even been opened yet. So the measurement system was theoretically in place, but in order for people to be able to settle, they came up with a system called preemption, whereby as a settler, you would go out, pick the land that you wanted, nominally improve it, which might be as little as plowing a furrow around the perimeter of your land, and then claiming it as your own, and then taking, once that was done, when the land office did open, you would then announce that you had preempted that land. That made for a lot of confrontations where people were trying to preempt the same land. But it was so important to people that in Naperville, for starting in the 1830s or so, up until about late 1940s, one of the leading the tavern in town was the Preemption House. So moving along to 1851, this is how these sections now are in place. And you see now that the townships have become named, and that's because in the mid 1800s, we went from survey townships to being civil townships, where the townships got named and became political units of government, but not necessarily with the original borders that they had. But in this case, we're looking at Downers Grove Township. I'm just going to mention here that there was a stand of trees over here to the left called a grove. Pierce Downer preempted his land and named his land Downers Grove. So each of these towns has got a story behind its name. We just won't talk about it right now. Over at the bend of the Des Plaines River, an important place where two trails converged or diverged coming from Chicago, one going west and the other one southwest, was Doty's Tavern, and that was Theodorus Doty, who had then preempted land there, and that was what you saw on that patent. So as time went on, that was 1851. This is 1862, and you can now see where the land has all been taken up. There were two kinds of people who took up land. There were people who were going to farm the land, and people who were going to who acquired the land purely for speculation. This diagonal line you see going down there, that's the old Indian boundary. And you also, in here, you see the proposed railroad. Another thing that was going on here was roads were starting to appear. There had been some original trails that went back to, basically they were animal traces that had become Native American trails. But once farms were established, you needed a way to get to the farms. So additional roads were cut through, generally speaking, on section lines or half section lines. In Chicago today, the big major arteries are section line and half section line streets. So in 1864, the railroad, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad opened. Locally, the company got called the Q, well, I'm going to the city. I'm going to take the Q to the city, which is where the name Towns Along the Q came from, is that these are towns along the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad that now is the BNSF for freight purposes and the Metra BNSF train line for commuter train purposes. So now communities are starting to gather around places along the railroad. Going back to 1851, we already had places that were gathering where there was something important. In the case of Brush Hill, there was a sawmill that became a grist mill. Downers had already established himself with somebody opened a blacksmith shop, and they became little agricultural centers. Naperville was Naper's settlement from Joseph Naper, and that just became Naperville. So with the coming of the railroad, though, that changed everything in the sense that one thing, important principle, access unlocks land values. And that cuts two ways. One is that it unlocks land values so that now the speculators had an opportunity to get their payoff value from having bought their land a long time ago. One of the problems going forward is that when you started getting railroads and especially trolley car lines in subsequent generations, it was the landowners who would encourage or even incorporate these trolley car lines. They would take their profits in the form of drastically increased land values, but it didn't leave a legacy for who's going to pay for operating of these things. In the early days, they could pretty much pay for themselves out of the fare box, but it basically set us up for our never-ending transit funding dilemma today, that they were built for that purpose of unlocking land values, but the land values are not necessarily paying for the ongoing operation cost. So what happened with the opening of the railroad? It attracted intentional suburbs, as I like to call them. These are people who saw this opportunity to create really high-end communities for people who had previously lived in the city, people especially being business owners and business managers who now had the money to be able to buy multiple ride tickets on the railroad and could buy land out in the country. They were well heeled enough that they didn't have to worry about financing. They basically were well off. I want to buy a lot. Here's my money. I want a house built for me. Here's my money. And that was that. So several of these high-end communities were established. Hinsdale, starting in about 1867, 68. One that wound up not taking off was Clarendon Hills, that was subdivided at that time, but not really settled until the 1920s, and we'll visit that in a few moments. The high profile one of all of these was Riverside. Along the banks of the Des Plaines River, Theodorus Doty's Tavern would have been at the bottom of this picture here. Riverside, a New York real estate developer by the name of Emery Childs put together an investment group, and they hired landscape architects, Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaugh, to design a community for them, which they did. Unfortunately for Riverside, it is a beautiful place. I know. I grew up at, if you can see my marker there, but I grew up at the corner of Lawton and Herbert in this magical little town. It wasn't necessarily magical at the beginning. It was, there were many, many flaws in the business model. Basically, the company that did the development went broke. This whole business west of the river, all of this never happened except for one little piece down in the corner. The rest of it did, and Riverside is a wonderful little community to this day. Another one was LaGrange, a merchant from near Tennessee, near Memphis, Tennessee, escaped the Civil War, kind of escaping by night with a canvas bag full of gold coins. Came up north, established himself as a successful merchant in downtown Chicago, bought land from somebody else who had tried to do a subdivision and established the community of LaGrange, named for his town that he came from in LaGrange, Tennessee. In LaGrange, though, there's something new that happened. Over to the right, you'll see Ira Brown's addition. Ira Brown was an eccentric and good-hearted real estate developer who believed in affordable housing. So I'm going to try to expand this so that you can see here. By the way, Lighters is Leiter of Levi Leiter, that's the co-founder of what later became the Marshall Fields department store. But you can see the lot sizes in these subdivisions, but then Ira Brown's are much more small lots. I'm looking for a statistic here. Lots in regular LaGrange sold for $15 a front foot, or $150 for a 100-foot frontage. That would cost now about $3,100 in 2021 money. Ira Brown sold his lots for $4 a front foot, with the lots only being half as wide. So you could get a lot for $540 instead of $3,100. And that wound up having long-term implications, because that then in the 1890s became the first town along the queue with African-American residents. So we're going to now go on. Once those places were established, the next thing that happened was that real estate developers would then start developing on the periphery of existing towns. So in the case of Downers Grove, north of the train tracks, a fellow by the name of E.H. Prince developed this subdivision, but not for the very, very wealthy the way Riverside and LaGrange Hinsdale had been. I love his advertising copy down at the bottom. I'm going to see if I can expand this and make this go up. He says, handsomest suburb in Chicago, no codfish aristocracy, criminals, toughs, or saloons. I think he was sticking his finger in the eye of Hinsdale, because so many of the early wealthy settlers in Chicago and movers and shakers in Chicago had come from New England, with Ogden being a perfect example. So what's important here is that Prince is now selling to the expanding middle class. By this time, economic growth in Chicago had come along to the point where, in addition to business owners and business managers, you were starting to have businesses large enough to have internal bureaucracies with middle-level managers and clerks and technicians and professionals that were not as wealthy and did need to do financing. And so we moved now to the place where the developer would provide financing. $4 a front foot. We're much farther west than LaGrange, so you couldn't command that high price that LaGrange was asking. And besides that, you're not trying to exclude anybody except for the codfish aristocracy. Easy terms, improvements. So that was now the next thing that was happening in the 1880s. Also in the 1880s, Samuel Gross showed up on the scene. Samuel Gross was an over-the-top real estate developer who had developed, I think it was 22 different communities already in Chicago by the time he bought land west of Riverside and named it for himself, Grossdale. Gross introduced a new concept, and that was I'll sell you a lot, but also, if you wish, I can sell you a house. So terms: 1/10 cash, balance on easy payments, long time, money loaned for building. So basically what's happening now is people are taking out two loans, in this case from the developer, one for the lot and the other one for the house. Now, what got a little goofy for Gross, he was, as I say, over the top. He would have, one report says that he chartered a 27-car train from Union Station in Chicago to come out to the site, and they had the brass band up on the roofs of the train cars, and they had the tent with the food and presumably alcoholic beverages, and then agents who would take you and show you the available lots and the sample homes, and it was expected that you would actually buy something. So what happened was that a lot of people bought lots expecting to build a house later, but this was in the very late 1800s and early 1880s and early 1890s. A lot of the people who bought lots then got tangled up in the 1893 Depression and were unable then to ever build houses on their lots. Ultimately, too, Grossdale, Samuel Gross wound up with a lot of unsold lots, which basically were his to deal with. Once it incorporated as Grossdale as a municipality, they started doing street assessments for improvements, and Gross promptly fell behind on his assessments. The residents got crosswise with him and renamed the town Brookfield, which is why you don't hear of Grossdale anymore. So in the meantime, what else was happening? By the late 1800s and the early 1900s, you had still expanding purchasing base, and especially ethnic people, in the case of Chicago's western suburbs, the Czech people who had settled in Pilsen and then moved out through Lawndale and Cicero and newly established Berwyn. They established savings and loans, or building and loans. This is from the epic movie, It's a Wonderful Life. So anyone who wants to understand how savings and loans works, watch the movie, because James Stewart provides a little college class explanation in one scene where he's trying to keep the bank open after there's been a run on the bank. Anyway, you had these buildings and loans where people would put their money in there, and then they would borrow against the money that had been deposited there. The loans tended to be 5, 6, 7 years. And when you repaid the loan, all you paid was the interest. It was a balloon mortgage, in effect, what we now call balloon mortgages, where you only paid the interest. Presumably during your 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 years, you were saving money on the side, so that after that time, when you went back to the building and loan and you said, well, my time is up, I need to get a new loan, but I want to borrow less now because I can give you this money. And that was just the process that went on year after year, decade after decade, that, as we'll see in a little while, eventually that became a problem. So as we got towards World War I era, several things happened. One was automobiles. Automobiles opened up vast amounts of land. You didn't have to be within walking distance of the train station anymore. So it it had the effect of depressing the land values because there's so much more land on the market. The second thing was it democratized it in that now a lot more people, assuming they could own an automobile, could have a much wider range of land to buy. Another thing that was happening, as I think it was in 1913, the nation established its first successful permanent national income tax. But in order to get that passed, they had to sweeten it with the mortgage interest deduction, which then became a subsidy for anyone borrowing money to buy land and build houses. So in the years right before and during and right after World War I, one of the things, starting in Portland, Oregon, lumber people were having a problem in that several cities had had big fires in the late 1800s, Chicago being one of them, and there was an increasing pressure to build with brick. Well, that wasn't helping the lumber people very much, but they said, well, you know what, if a smaller sliver of the pie, but it's a much bigger pie, then we're going to come out all right. So the lumber people and the furniture dealers and the car dealers and the oil companies and anybody who had an economic stake in geographical expansion, they all went together on this concerted thing called the Own Your Own Home movement. I love this commercial. I mean, this ad, because what it's doing is it's showing, well, everybody's on board. The newspapers, the Chamber of Commerce, the YMCA, the schools, it doesn't show here, but labor unions and all, we're all on board with this. And so it was kind of taking hold, during World War I. It was building materials were hard to come by, so that put a damper on it. But right after the World War I, then several more things happened. Here's another example of how somebody jumped on the bandwagon with self-interest. General Electric, well, their stake in this is that if you build more trolley car lines, they will sell more stuff. So let's build more trolley car lines to more places. But there's a message here that's several messages, very important. One is creating the perception of enter suburbs, exit slums. Oh my gosh, you cannot believe what an awful place you live in. Either because of proximity to icky land uses, proximity to people you don't like, or that you live in the dreaded apartment buildings, and that there was lurid tales of sexual promiscuity and just awful things because people lived in apartment buildings. They were breeding grounds for communism. So the other thing that was important here was the emphasis on the children. Children can reach the cool beaches for a few pennies instead of being condemned to the hot pavements all summer. Well, we thank you, General Electric, for saving the children. But there was a lot of saving to happen here. As many of, I think maybe all of us are familiar with, 1917 brought the Bolshevik Revolution. And it was a difficult time in the United States as well, in terms of right after there had been extreme inflation, but then a sharp depression. There was a lot of unrest, popular unrest, and a lot of concern that, oh my gosh, the Bolsheviks are going to take over the US of A. So what do we do about it? The best thing to do to stop a revolution from happening is to have people own your own home. Then you've got a stake in your hand, and you're going to say, I'm going to stand up for what's right and not let those commies take over. So remember the slums. So now the message really turned to, is this what you want for your children? Or is this what you want for your children? what was important here is the federal government co-opted the Own Your Own Home program. So now you have automobiles, income tax exempt, mortgage interest exemption, this big campaign, and people did really want to move to the country. So big time developers now jumped on this and said, we can make this happen. So one of the big developers was Arthur T. McIntosh Company. I showed you early on about Clarendon Hills. It was an attempt at a high-end subdivision that failed. McIntosh, right after World War I, set about to do huge developments in Clarendon Hills and adjoining what had been a town called Greg's, named for a brickyard, but they renamed it Westmont because it has a nice sound to it, a saleable name. So I'm going to blow up this image. I'll come back to it in a moment. Again, with the children. First, for your children, don't take chances of bringing them up in the city. The city streets are not only full of danger to life and limb, but they are often breeding places of evil habits. So we want our children to have fresh air and sunshine and roses of health on their cheeks, and cut down on your doctor's bills. So we are really kind of trying to vilify the city in any way possible for the sake of selling lots. I'll go back for a moment because now Arthur T. McIntosh was also doing financing, and they took a page from Gross's style. They chartered trains. You could come out any weekend on a guided tour. People would meet you at Union Station, but they also would have whole trains that would come out to Clarendon Hills and Westmont so that people could see the wholesome environment. So watch us grow, large lots, very low prices, easy terms. But easy terms were on these short horizon 5, 6, 7 year mortgages. But another thing that happened along the way, McIntosh, this is from a Chicago Tribune article. Mr. Howe states that residence property is highly restricted and care will be taken in selling the lots to avoid undesirables. So undesirables, generally speaking, meant African Americans, but really Asians, sometimes in the most restrictive way, it would be just white Protestants. There were all variations on this, but the important thing was a couple of things that happened along the way. In the years before World War I, there had been an attempt to introduce racially restrictive municipal zoning. That was struck down by a Supreme Court case in 1917, Buchanan versus Warley, but in its place was the concept of the restrictive covenant that was attached to the deed to the property. You can buy this property, but you must never, here you go, no property shall be at any time sold, conveyed, rented, or leased in whole or part to any person or persons not of the white or Caucasian race. No person shall be allowed to occupy except for domestic servants. So that was among many restrictions. But basically what was happening here, there were two things. One was people had a bad attitude towards people they deemed undesirable. And the second thing was people had already in generations previous experienced decline in land values where because of either objectionable land uses or the presence of people who were deemed objectionable to the property owners, the proximity caused people to leave. A lot of them drove down the prices and people said, oh my gosh, that's what happens. if you let those people move near you. So we want to be out here in the suburbs, and we don't want any of that kind of stuff to follow us. This is after World War II in South LaGrange. This is a deed where restriction is no part of this real estate shall be conveyed or leased to any person not of the Caucasian race. Now, in 1947, there was Shelley versus Kramer, where the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the enforceability of racial and other restrictive covenants. But it was only the enforceability. It didn't say you couldn't have them. It's just that they wouldn't be enforced. So that means if you want to press the issue and you got the money for a lawyer, yes, you can do that, but it effectively remains, it left the restriction in place. This is why we're calling this suburban housing for most of us. Oops. Well, we didn't want to see all the pictures at once. So another thing that happened in the 1920s is that in the giddy rush to develop suburban properties, subdividers way outran the ability of people to buy houses, and whole books have been written about why that is. One of the things that is cited is not just basic supply and demand, but the availability of electricity meant that people were buying household appliances too. And they were, well, I only have this much money to spend. I can either have my old house in the city with cool appliances, or I can get the new house, but I'm not going to have all those appliances yet. Anyway, one suburb after another experienced great acreage of subdividing with no houses. This is in the west end of Brookfield. That's the trolley car line that went out to LaGrange, following or running somewhat parallel to the Burlington Railroad. This is a picture from about 1947, where it had been subdivided at least a decade before, and just now the first houses are getting built out there. So what happened? The Great Depression. So several things happened. One is all these people with these 5, 6, 7-year mortgages, they went back to renew their mortgage. And one thing that might have happened is, well, now they didn't have a job at the moment. They're in between jobs. And the lender said, well, yeah, I'd like to accommodate you, but I don't see how you're going to be able to make your payments. So we're not going to be able to renew this. But maybe the larger thing was that version of the liquidity crisis. The lender said, I'm sorry, I don't have money to lend you. And so vast quantities of properties throughout the nation went into foreclosure. The Hoover administration sought to deal with it, and then the Roosevelt administration, but it eventually became Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration to, number one, let's pump some liquidity back into the system. Number two is alleviate the lender's fear that people are going to, they're not going to have to foreclose on people's houses. Number three is, well, so then the two, so you had guaranteed mortgage loans. Well, when you're gonna, so they extended the thing out. Well, this business of 5, 6, 7 years doesn't work. We're going to come up with a 25-year mortgage, which then eventually became a 30-year mortgage, where it was self-amortizing, where you now are paying both on the principal and the interest. But now the problem was guaranteeing the loans. It was one thing to be concerned about how well the person is going to pay. The second thing is, what's the condition of the house? But now the third thing was, its condition of the neighborhood. Is this neighborhood still going to hold its value 30 years from now? Or are we going to be guaranteed on mortgages on something where the houses, none of the houses have held their value? So all of this process led to color coding, and I'm going to choose my words very carefully here. This is a map of showing the various color codes. You don't see any green here, but green was the best place the best place for lenders to lend money. Blue was pretty okay too, but if it was yellow, it was designated declining, and red, don't do it. Now, this is where I'm going to choose my words very carefully. These maps have only become aware in the public realm in the last just few years. These were locked in a vault in Washington, D.C. Yes, there was redlining. Yes, there was color coding, but it was not nearly to the draconian way that would be indicated on these maps. And I'll give you an example. My beloved Riverside, that Frederick Law Olmsted community, this whole section, including my house for 20 years, was all in what's deemed a declining neighborhood. Well, you can go out there now, it's 1940, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 80 years later, I, as a fairly well-heeled person, can't afford the house that I grew up in. The neighborhoods didn't decline. What it was, and so this information was only kind of vaguely made available to the lenders, but not with all of this specificity. So it's something that I use this map as a cautionary thing to just illustrate how color coding happened. There's a couple of interesting things about this. This color coding of Forest View and Stickney were redlined because the Al Capone crime syndicate had opened up bordellos down there, and it wasn't deemed an appropriate place for families to have homes. In fact, by mid-1950s, every one of these blocks just about was filled with homes. So that I just caution anyone looking at maps like this to understand the narrow context of the color-coded maps. The other thing that came out of FHA is that FHA was trying to solve a lot of problems, not just the money problems, but the problems of automobiles. And we want neighborhoods that are relatively free of speeding automobiles. So we're going to go back to the thinkers, the Clarence Steins and others of the 1920s, who came up with ideal neighborhoods, and this is how it should look. So you've got perimeter highways, and you've got a community center, but these are neighborhood non-commercial institutions, only big enough for one school, with your commercial stuff at the corners. There are some places, Radburn, New Jersey is a good example of one of these experimental towns. Another one is Forest Hills in Queens, New York, based on this. What FHA did was, yeah, this is really great. We like this. We like this so much that if you want, Mr. Developer, if you want the properties in your development to be insured, you have to use our guidelines. And so it instantly transformed. Instead of having the grid system or the gently curving streets like in Riverside, you have this thing where you have intentionally not direct streets. We're going to look at a current day map. This is in South Downers Grove. That's 63rd Street, Main Street, Fairview Avenue, and 75th Street. Those, by the way, are section line streets and half section line streets. This is FHA in action, even though this was developed, probably in the late 1960s. What do you have? You've got the grade school in the middle. You've got the broken street pattern. They, by this time, had introduced cul-de-sacs and little loops and other indirect streets with the commercial stuff down around the corner. And basically what you are looking at is post-war America. So I told you it would be a half hour, and I actually went 53 minutes less introductions, but I'm just now going to come back to what did we just do in the last 45 minutes or so. We did how was the land bought, how was it paid for, real estate development practices, exclusion of undesirable land uses and people, reform of the mortgage system, and the influence on community structure. And with that, I will end my hopscotching across the water with too many concepts in too short of a time, but I got enthusiastic. So with that, I'm going to stop share and then defer to either Dan or Sue or Adam, who will be the MC and entertain questions to the extent that I can answer them.
Yeah, I don't have any questions. I have 3 comments in the Q&A. There might be
All right.
some in chat. I'll have to go dig through chat. But they were, one was that Chicago was the home of the infamous jungle of Upton Sinclair. So I don't think people needed too much advertising to know how horrible slums were, especially in Chicago. I haven't read Jungle. I thought it was mostly about the meat packing, but it might have been about the slums.
Very much about the back of the yards neighborhood surrounding and life in the back of the yards neighborhood surrounding the stockyards.
Okay.
I haven't read it either.
He thought segregation was a ploy for the landlords to price gouge whites. In other words, they would, I guess, get you to pay a whole lot of money to be in an all-white neighborhood.
There are so many different interpretations and shades of meaning of what was going on, really from the earliest settlement of not necessarily the pioneers, but once the train line was open, people moved out to various suburbs, partly for the fresh air, but partly to get away from something or somebody they didn't like. And so it was, I'm not a big subscriber to that conspiracy theory that it was a way to gouge on prices.
Yeah. Were there any African-American neighborhoods that were not redlined?
I have no idea. I'd actually like to know that and encourage people who are attending this to investigate that and report back.
Okay. And
That should depend on the era. In the 1920s, the African American area was significantly smaller than after the 1950s.
A little note about African Americans out in the towns along the Q. There were African Americans, well-heeled professional people who moved to LaGrange in the 1890s, both in the Ira Brown subdivision that I showed you, but also in the Levi Leiter and Franklin Cosett subdivisions. And it was what I can understand, things were kind of okay with everybody concerned until the 1920s. And then it's attributed to the Ku Klux Klan. I have to take people's word for it until I understand more. The Ku Klux Klan put increasing pressure on the town to exclude African Americans and say, if you're an African American, you've got to live it down at the bottom of the hill. There's a prehistoric lakeshore there, which is why I call it the bottom of the hill, down to the Ira Brown subdivision. One African American family loved their house so much, they actually moved their entire house down the hill. So it wasn't really until an African American doctor moved into Western Springs about 1953, but it really wasn't until Naperville when I-88 opened up the interstate highway and big office complexes started to open. Bell Labs opened along I-88 in the late 1960s. And Black PhDs came to work there and they said, oh, this is a lovely place. I want to live in Naperville. And the realtor said, well, no, you can't live here. And that was the big showdown that really broke the color line in the western suburbs.
Ed Dodson asked, did your research confirm the role of bank-hired property appraisers in characterizing neighborhoods as declining?
Yes, and I have a rudimentary understanding of all this, basically for researching the Towns Along the Q book. But with FHA setting up this nationwide bureaucracy, they basically had to hire appraisers that they were never, the people in the general office in Washington, D.C. were never going to see these appraisers. They were never actually going to have a face-to-face conversation. We have to come up with a set of standards for them to go by as far as what their appraisal conclusions are. So the bureaucracy led to rules, which then led to probably some superficial conclusions about property conditions and neighborhood conditions.
Yeah, I was thinking that you know, that the redlining might have been based on accurate predictions, but once you redline a neighborhood, you guarantee that it will decline because if nobody can finance improvements, it's not going to be improved.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that's important, what you just said was very important. If nobody can apply finance improvements, that's part of it that's kind of gotten blown out of proportion. That redlining puts a damper on it, but it's by no means a nobody thing. Rather, it just has restricted the flow of funds into those communities. It's not like a faucet just got shut off.
Okay, so it's just a little harder to get a loan, and probably a lot of people who could improve things with their own money had an advantage.
They did, and the people who couldn't improve then, as properties then just deteriorated over time, as railings broke and paint peeled and broken window panes didn't get fixed, and this and that didn't get fixed. New buyers coming in are saying, well, these people aren't maintaining their houses very well. I don't think I want to live here. And so that's the way in which it only takes some buildings being not maintained up to standard because people couldn't get any money for it, that then results in the decline of the neighborhood.
Okay. Polly asked, Polly Cleveland, what is the history of property taxation to finance townships?
I'm going to share screen again because there's an important thing there.
Yeah.
I see the screen again?
Yeah, my understanding was the property tax was big like until 1930s.
So the original township concept, this was when they were survey townships, laid the groundwork for that, especially if I can get this to work. I've gotten lost. I'm trying to get back to okay. When they were survey townships, how it was supposed to work, detail of township down at the bottom. Everybody can see that all right?
Mhm.
Income from section 16, one section out of each 36 miles was the school section. And the idea was, in the early days, you didn't have a lot of other services because they weren't governmental units yet, but you did want to pay for schools. Now, I am not a knowledgeable person about the history of how property taxes evolved, other than say, way back when, remember those roads that had to get to the farms? Somebody had to maintain the roads. And so you had a system whereby every citizen had an obligation to give 2 or 3 days of work every month to maintain the roads. And the people said, well, wow, wait a minute, I have my farm to maintain. I got my business to run. I can't do that. Can I just give you money? And so they started getting money. Well, then they just institutionalized that. Okay, nobody has to go out anymore, but you do have to pay the money. And my understanding is that was the basis of where property taxes came from.
That's also exactly how feudalism arose out of common law societies, because the early lords assigned, your taxes were in the form of work obligations. And as money crept into the system, you could pay a fee, and FEU is the Old English spelling of fee. So feudalism was basically a fee system instead of an assigned labor system. And where it broke down is then the lords were now accumulating a purse, which gave them power. That's but that's in ancient England, and I wouldn't be surprised if these early settlements in America, if they were in places where money was scarce, would also start a tax system based on expected work obligations. Can you tell us about the projects developed, like the Cabrini Green buildings, and their impact on neighborhood decline and gentrification, and how gentrification changed that?
It's a whole nother topic that I have to shake the rust off of my master's degree from all those years ago.
Well, do you know what a Cabrini? I don't know what a Cabrini.
So Cabrini Green was a housing project, and basically in the 1930s there was an idealistic notion that, well, maybe we can build some housing that is public housing to tide people over till they get back on their feet, and it was going to be integrated. And then when integrated public housing, the trouble was, because of racial inequity and Black people being the first to be fired and the last to be hired, what do you know, when people get hired, the white people get hired, they move out, it becomes a Black building. But after World War II, there was a desire to create more public housing, but you couldn't put it anywhere because the white people didn't want these. They thought they were breeding grounds for crime. And so, I don't want them in my neighborhood. I don't want them in my neighborhood. So you wound up doing these high rises in order to concentrate them. Cabrini Green was one of those high rise buildings. That whole thing went on for decades, until a series of court decisions, I think starting with Igo Pruitt in St. Louis, said, no, we can't do that anymore. And so now those housing projects have gone, but now what has taken its place? Nature abhors a vacuum. So you had these, like Cabrini Green on the near north side of Chicago. Once that's not there anymore, oh my gosh, look, this is convenient land of the city. Let's snatch it up. I'd also like to mention about Cabrini Green, that housing center was a pretty nefarious place for most of the time. But what did it replace? It replaced Little Hell, the Italian neighborhood that I suspect Cabrini Green was comparatively calm and upstanding in comparison to what it had been like when it was the Italian neighborhood in the very late 1800s and early 1900s.
Ed Dodson, as a follow-up comment, the appraisers were in some cities paid by investors to make negative comments about properties in neighborhoods for the simple reason that they, I guess the investors, wanted to acquire single-family properties and convert them into multi-unit rental prices. And this drove prices downward. The investor speculators achieved their objective by influencing the appraisers, I guess. Is that?
There's a lot that's packed into that right there. There's one of the things that in looking at Chicago history, neighborhoods that once were high-end neighborhoods that stopped being high-end neighborhoods went through a process whereby declining land values caused the original high-end people to move out. And then either by organic forces or by intentionality, certain neighborhoods, the near west side of Chicago being a good example, by intentional disinvestment by the city, you created a situation, an incentive to break those up into smaller units in order to draw the incoming African-American community from the South into that neighborhood and steer it away from other neighborhoods. There's a wonderful book I recommend called Block by Block by Amanda Seligman, who she documents how did the whole west side of Chicago integrate and resegregate. And she discusses that very topic.
Fred Boner wants to know, I'm sure it's some of each. Do you know how much of the developments were from buying up farms to subdivide, and how much was on virgin land?
I don't know, statistically or even terribly much relationally, other than I mentioned the speculators, and there was a lot of land that just remained fallow and a lot that did get farmed. My gut feeling is that by the early 1900s, almost all the open land was being farmed. And it might be that speculators would hold that and they would make it available to tenants. But there are one thing I didn't mention about the 1920s. We had the automobiles, we had the income tax exemption, we had the fear of communism, all these different things pushing people towards the suburbs. But there was the pull that mechanization of farming after World War I caused farm prices to plummet. So much more production was getting had by each acre that if you've got land that you can do something other than farming, the farmers were more than happy to cash out. Or if they wanted to keep farming, they could cash out on their existing land, take their big pile of money, and then go and buy somebody else's farm at rock bottom prices and then resume farming.
Yeah, and the advent of the automobile was also the advent of the produce truck, so that farmers no longer had to be close to cities, that the distance between the farm and the market could expand. So land further out that you could not profitably farm, you could now move further out, sell your farm close in, move further on, and that same advantage worked because now you could put everything on a truck.
That's a process that had been going on for in different forms for generations, in the sense that in the first farmers that came west were subsistence farmers, but then they grew wheat. But as land farther west, Nebraska, South Dakota, Kansas, that became better for wheat, and so corn took over. But once railroads could bring corn in from Iowa and places, that's when DuPage County is the county, first county west of Cook County in Chicago. It became much more produce and dairy. And especially with dairy, that dairy then, Wisconsin wasn't necessarily the dairy state yet, because it was hard to transport the dairy products any distance, unless you turn them into cheese. So with the coming of motor trucks, though, that then, well, coming of the railroad made an area in DuPage County dairy land, but then the motor trucks meant you could bring it in from much farther away, especially when you had much improved highways. And so that also opened up land for residential development.
Let me go back through some of Giannis's questions. He had a lot of them and I skipped over them to get to other people. Well, this is a big one too. Can you summarize the different theorists behind urban planning? I would think there would be I think there would be a ton of those.
I'll maybe just touch on one thing that happened in Chicago and in cities. The World Columbian Exposition of 1893, people said, "Whoa, this is really an amazing thing." In the midst of a kind of a gloomy city, especially because the World's Fair was in 1893 in the middle of the Depression. People said, "Wow, wouldn't it be nice if the whole city could be this great?" And so it gave rise to the City Beautiful movement. Well, how are we going to make the city beautiful? Well, we have to think about intentionally making things beautiful, and making things beautiful means that let's separate the land uses. And so then that led to planning and zoning. And so that's kind of the nickel version of one way that urban planning came about.
I know in Pittsburgh, they wanted it. You're allowed to have tall skyscrapers, but not close to the rivers. So that, and I always said, you're acting like your city is a flower arrangement. But you have near the rivers, all the buildings are short so that the taller buildings can be behind them and it looks nicer. And I guess the tall buildings in the center can have a view from the upper floors because they're not blocked by other tall buildings between them and the rivers.
So that's why there's short buildings on Fort Pitt Boulevard or whichever that is. All right.
Yeah, Fort Pitt and Fort Duquesne are both rivers. On both rivers, the buildings are short, and that's by zoning. That's not the market at work.
Makes for a great view from the baseball stadium.
Yes, and from Mount Washington and everything.
Right.
Yeah, you couldn't buy back the home you grew up in. Is there a reason why your family sold the home in the first place?
I actually bought the house from my mother. We moved in when I was in fourth grade. I bought it from her, and then I lived in that house for about 5 years after I bought it. I got transferred out of town, so that's why we sold the house. Then we moved back from Washington, D.C., briefly to Riverside, bought a house that we couldn't afford. My, without getting into too much information, my first wife and I got divorced, and I personally didn't care for home ownership and maintenance. Hey, I'm going to be a single guy. I rented a really nice little apartment in Oak Park because I wanted to be near to transportation. I live in a condominium now, but going back to the point that I can't afford it, can't is a relative term. Can't and won't are,
There's not a sharp border between those.
Yeah, I will not allocate that portion of the family nest egg for a single family home. But it was, my little house that my mother bought in 1958 for $22,000. The last I saw, it was about $550,000, which doesn't run a lot farther than the consumer price index, the inflation index. But the context in which I made that remark was that was a so-called declining neighborhood.
Yeah.
Didn't decline.
Giannis is wanting to know if you can elaborate on how the Dan Ryan Expressway first led to the decline of the near West Side, and how it's now a real estate hotspot for condos.
So there's a number of pieces to that. One thing, first of all, is to understand Chicago being by the lake. The expressway system runs out in a series of spokes. So the Kennedy Expressway goes northwest, the Eisenhower goes straight west, and the Dan Ryan goes straight south. So the Dan Ryan Expressway, except for right close to downtown, is not really about the near west side. That being said, a couple things about locations of expressways. There are many interpretations of how expressways are located where they are. There are people who will charge them, well, it was deliberately run through the black neighborhood, or it was built as a barrier to the little community of Bridgeport, where we had about 3-4 decades, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 5 decades of Chicago mayors all came from this little South Side neighborhood of Bridgeport. That was already a place where the Bridgeport residents had a figurative wall, not in the form, well, there were railroad viaducts, but inhospitable. Any minority who comes over here is going to get the living something beat out of them. When they went to build this expressway, it was built through the black neighborhood. Now, you could call that intentional racism, and I'm not going to just categorically say that there isn't an element, but look at it from the standpoint of the people who have been charged with the responsibility of creating a roadway where none was before, and we have to acquire property. In order to shepherd the taxpayers' money, you buy the least expensive property that you can get. And so, unfortunately, that becomes de facto racist in the sense that that's already the neighborhood where the black people live. So just to elaborate, though, on the near west side, the Congress Expressway that became the Eisenhower Expressway, there have been charges leveled that there was a game being played here. Number one, to do land clearance on the near west side to create a buffer around the downtown, kind of like a castle moat, and that expressway construction was going to help do that. And that Another thing was that it would depress the land values so that certain privileged people could buy up the depressed land around the expressway, and eventually get it to gentrify and make money. There are so many nuances to that would be a college course unto itself.
Yeah, somebody mentioned that the Jeffersons, the TV show The Jeffersons, was set in a Cabrini Green high-rise. And
Wasn't.
It wasn't?
Wasn't. There was a TV show. It wasn't the Jeffersons. The Jeffersons lived in Queens,
In New York, yeah, because
New York.
they were a spin-off of Archie Bunker.
Next to our Jeffersons, I think, moved up in New York. Now
Yeah.
there was, I think it was Good Times. It started out with the guy saying, "What's happening?" That was the one that's opened up with rapid transit train cars going across a bridge in Chicago. I think that's the one that was set in Cabrini Green.
Okay, there's more comments in chat, but Sue sent me a note that we are getting to our end of time. So so I wanted to turn it over to Sue to tell us what the next event is.
Next month, we will be on for August 19th. And our speaker will be Derek Saghorn, who is the Vice President of Common Ground USA and a transit and affordable housing activist out in Oakland, California. And so we invite you then. We also invite you to our something coming up this Sunday. If we were to have met in person, we always do a farewell friendship brunch. Well, this is the farewell friendship gathering, which will happen this Sunday, which is the 18th of July at 7 p.m. It's a Sunday night, and 7 p.m. being Eastern time. We will have the event, and we will be honoring the late Walt Rybeck, Paul Justice, Harry Pollard, and Fred Fovery, among others. So we invite you to come along, and it's open to all. Thanks for this.
I want to thank you for once again for giving me the opportunity to present to the Council of Georgist Organizations.
Yeah, and there was some interesting details about how these things come together that, Georgists usually have the concept, the theoretical concept, but it's really good to actually know the particulars of the story of how these things happen. So that I liked it quite a bit. And I thank you. And
Thanks.
with that, we'll wrap up, and we have several people who help out with these. They are listed on the CGO website, which is cgocouncil.org. And our biggest sponsor is the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation. So that's pretty much it. Thank you, and hope to see you again on one of these.
All right. Okay, I'm going to do the Zoom wave.
Okay, bye.